Hi volunteers, welcome to SIA, the Smithsonian Institution Archives. I am Allison Ruppert-Gerber. I'm our preservation coordinator at the Archives.
And I'm Kira Sobers. I'm our digital media coordinator here at SI Archives.
So over the past 4 years, the Smithsonian Institution Archives has been leading a pan-institutional survey and assessment of our audiovisual collections, and it's really helped us to gather the foundational data that we'll need for future digitization initiatives around the institution. Some of the statistics that came out of that was that we hold over 293,000 audiovisual assets between 11 units at the Smithsonian, which is a pretty large number, and we really had no idea how much we had before the survey and the assessment. And also, when I say audiovisual formats, what I mean is that anything that is recorded on an analog audiovisual asset. So some examples of that, our most popular formats at the institution are compact audio cassettes, quarter-inch audio reels, and 16mm film. So audiovisual assets include audio formats and also like moving image, so film and video. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about challenges to AV preservation as you all start tackling audio transcription in the Transcription Center. We think it's important for you to understand some of the challenges that come along with these collections. And so the first one we're going to talk about is physical storage. So AV collections come in a lot of different formats and a lot of different sizes and require a lot of different housing. So films go into film cans, magnetic media like VHS tapes go into their VHS carriers, and all of these need to be stored in specialized environments to extend their longevity. And a lot of times that comes in frozen storage, which is expensive to build and it's expensive to maintain. But if we want to maintain the physical formats for as long as possible until they can be digitized, and then even afterwards, it's an important thing for us to invest money in, and we're sort of falling short on that. And so a lot of units within the Smithsonian don't have enough space for at least 10 years. So we're kind of at the 10-year mark right now where people are going to run out of space at that time, and then we don't really know what we're going to do after that.
Another challenge to AV preservation is equipment obsolescence and maintenance. So a lot of the materials that we are working to preserve were created 50, 60 years ago, and the decks no longer exist. They're no longer being manufactured. And so finding existing decks from places like studios that are going out of scope, out of business, and other like places like eBay, collectors that have the material, not only can be time consuming and costly to try and like acquire the material, but once we get the decks, they also can be expensive to maintain. We just recently got a quote for a deck that for brand new refurbished, brand new being a relative term, but a completely refurbished version of a pneumatic deck from the 70s, 80s is gonna be about $5,000. And that's for one digitization, like one deck to be able to do transfers, which is pretty steep cost.
And then finding people who even know how to maintain the decks is really challenging as well. There are only a handful of people, and they've sort of been doing this for a really long time, and so they're like really passionate about that, but we're not training new people in the workforce to maintain equipment that existed like in the 70s and the 80s. And a lot of the parts that are in that in those equipment, like you can't find the replacements anymore.
Absolutely. So like your VHS tape player that you had as a kid, there's a tiny little plastic part in there that breaks all the time, and they no longer manufacture that part, and so it's something that can't be replaced. We can't fix it because the deck works except for that tiny little plastic crucial part that's no longer being made. So instead what you end up with is places like the Smithsonian, Library of Congress, National Archives that have these giant bays of old decks that don't work but that we're keeping for those tiny little plastic parts that we might be able to use to sort of Frankenstein together a working deck.
Yeah. I think we've even talked about before too, the being able to use 3D printing, because that technology has become so prevalent to just like print these small parts, but the need for it isn't there. And so even that, it seems like such a a good solution to that, but
the cost of development of getting that 3D printed version for that single part that somebody might need is too expensive.
Yeah. Okay, next challenge we're going to talk about is intellectual control. And so when we say that, we mean recording all of our collections at an item level. And this is particularly important with AV collections because there's so many different nuances to each individual asset that it's incredibly important to document that. So just not only the format and the media type, so like what the carrier is made of, but we want to record things like speed signal and duration and things like that, because then that helps us plan in the future for digitization projects. And a lot of times in archives in particular, we like to describe things at the collection level or at the folder level. And that's really not useful for AV collections, because knowing that one box contains 6 VHS tapes doesn't really help us plan for digitization, because we really don't know anything other than that. And each one of them might require a very specific digitization protocol depending on like what the content is, how long it is, does it have condition issues. And so it's incredibly important to document everything at an item level. And 5 out of the 11 units that we surveyed in the assessment that we did have less than 50% of their AV collections described at item level. And so it's a pretty staggering statistic.
Absolutely. And another barrier to intellectual control is that a lot of times the tapes that we receive have a very minimal description on the label, if any label at all. And so there's really no way to know what the content is and to know how important that content is to us. We've had a really awesome like camera original footage of an interview come through on a label that just said like, you know, Simon tape 1. Okay, I have no idea who Simon is without popping the tape into the deck, which can be a lot of wear and tear on the tapes themselves. We try not to play them back too many times. And so digitization is usually like how we gain some of that intellectual control for these materials, because then we can see the content and review it and catalog it more intensely and more deeply without putting any more stress on the physical tape itself.
Well, and that's one aspect too that volunteers can help us out with, is doing the transcription and describing the content, because that gets really time consuming for staff. And so if we focus on the digitization side of it, the preservation side of it, to simply just get digitized files of these collections, and the volunteers can step in and really help us out with figuring out what that content is and how important it is. And so that's really invaluable for us.
Absolutely. And that leads us into the next challenge, which is staffing. There are, of all of 11 units that were surveyed at the archives, there are only 7 AV archivists that are performing in-house preservation, and only one of them spends 100% of their time doing so. The other 6 spend less than 50% of their time actually doing in-house audiovisual preservation work. And part of that is because of these other tasks that are associated with AV preservation that are taking up our time, such as trying to describe things at an item level so that we can make a case for digitization of these materials. There's also a lot of administrative time spent. There's a lot of like grant writing and other associated work trying to get things done at the item level, trying to advocate for our collections.
And so that's pretty staggering. For 11 units, we have around 300,000 audiovisual assets among those 11 units. Only one person at the institution is dedicating 100% of their time to digitizing these.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a sustainable preservation rate.
It's not.
Okay, so the next challenge we want to talk about is funding. So where do we get the money from to do this? Since it's such a complicated topic and it has so many different nuances that you need to address, from like cataloging to digitization to quality control checking the files afterwards, to ingesting them into the dams and then pushing them out to access portals. Like that is all the lifespan of the audiovisual asset. It takes a lot of money to do that. And so a lot of units around the institution don't have line items in their budget for AV preservation. And so oftentimes we're relying on grant funding to fund those opportunities, and sometimes they only fund a portion of that preservation, so just the digitization portion. So we're still looking at doing the cataloging on our side of things, and then processing on all the files on the back end and pushing them out to all of our access portals. And sometimes those grants are external, which can have a lot more requirements than some of our internally available grants. And so it ends up taking a big chunk of time from staff to apply for these grants. And then if you don't get the funding, it sort of makes you feel like you've lost money and you've lost your time, and you could have been spending that time digitizing things, but instead you're trying to convince people yet again that AV collections are important and they deserve funding. And so it's a huge issue at the institution.
Absolutely. And our last challenge is disaster preparedness. There are specialized requirements for AV material when it comes to disaster preparedness scenarios, and there are only 27% of the units that we surveyed that actually have AV preservation included and AV items included in their disaster recovery plans, which is kind of staggering as a number.
And the disaster preparedness is one of those things that people don't really think about because it's behind the scenes and it requires a lot of pre-work, but you want to make sure that you have it in place if a disaster ever happens. And so heaven forbid, like you had a water emergency with your AV collections and everything was submerged in water for 5 hours. How would you even go about recovering that? What would you choose to recover first, and what can you assume is totally lost at that point if it's been underwater for 5 hours? And so a lot of those prioritization methods and decision making, those aren't built into anybody's disaster response plan at the institution, and it's critical to have that in place if you find yourself in a disaster situation.
Agreed. The one nice thing is that because we were able to do this AV survey of audiovisual collections around the institution, we've started to get some more pan-institutional support, and we are currently in the process of a audio pilot project to digitize some materials that are ultimately going to be coming into the transcription center, so look for those soon. It's going to be radio programs from the Archives of American Art and SIA, some really exciting, cool content that we just recently got to hear that, again, is material that hasn't been heard, at least for our material here at SIA. I have been here for 11 years and had never heard these radio programs, and they're interesting and very timely to today's environment. So look for those in the coming months in the transcription center.
So thank you guys for joining us. We would like to invite you to do a Q&A with us again on July 5th, and we hope to see you there.